Thank you so much, the Master of Ceremonies, our guest of honor, members of staff of Uganda Pentocostal University, distinguished guests, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, warm greetings to you all. I probably happen to be the only non-lawyer in this meeting this evening. And when I received the invitation to speak at this occasion, I wondered why such a decision was made. But probably there is one or two things the organizers of this farewell party believed you members of this university would benefit from my small experience. The subject I was asked to discuss relates to human rights activism in the 21st century. Though I'm not a lawyer, I have over the years interacted with lawyers on a day-to-day basis. I have also written academic papers touching on matters of law, especially in regards to human rights, and most importantly, the human right freedom of expression. One of my degrees is also in human rights, so it gives me some bit of expertise as I approach today's subject of discussion. Before I delve into the specifics of today's discussion, it is important for us to remind ourselves of the philosophical foundations of what human rights are. Because there is an age-old debate and disagreement in terms of the universality of human rights. Some people believe human rights are universal. Others argue that they are culturally relative. And it's an age-old debate which we are not going to conclude this evening. However, the edifice of human rights sinks its roots in three major areas. One is religion, which is very critical, especially at this time when I'm speaking to students of the Uganda Pentocostal University. So, religion provides a firm ground for what we call human rights. Then another area is philosophy. The third area is historical progression. This area is so important and critical because as ethical lawyers from Uganda Pentocostal University, you need to have a human face in whatever you're going to do, whether as corporate lawyers, as lawyers in the public service, or as human rights activists. I know many of you here at the end of the day are going to specialize in human rights law. So it is important for you to always dig deeper into the philosophical foundations of human rights. When we talk about philosophy as a foundation for human rights, we mean the writings of so many philosophers that came before us, even before the birth of Jesus Christ, and even before the birth of Prophet Muhammad for the Muslims here. Philosophers way back provided raw data that informs what we today call human rights. Provided raw data that informs the laws we have in our bills of rights, the laws we have in our constitutions, the laws we have in our several acts that protect fundamental human rights. So it's not a new discussion. When we go back to the writings of Plato and Aristotle, we see them agreeing on what they called moral absolutism. And here, they argued for the universality of values. Their view is that there are absolute standards against which moral questions can be judged, and that certain actions are right or wrong, regardless of the context of the act. So when we talk about the universality of values and rights, Plato and Aristotle talked about these things, but certainly using different words, many years before the birth of Christ, many years before the UDHR of 1948, many years before you had the Second World War, many years before you had the Crimean War. You're talking about wars where thousands were massacred. Plato and Aristotle had argued that certain values are universal. What is good for a man, it should be good for a woman. One of your colleagues here, who's just walking in again here, talked about in her presentation about the struggle for the female folks to survive in this turbulent world, which is very competitive. So we are not talking about a new discussion. We are talking about a discussion that has existed for ages. That Plato, who lived in that very patriarchal society, much more patriarchal than the society you're talking about today, but they believed in those values. They further argued that morals are inherent in the laws of the universe and the nature of humanity. That these rights are inherent, they are inborn, they are inalienable, meaning that they should never be taken away from us. They are indivisible, and they are everywhere. And to them, it's God who decreed that way. That is how important they were to them, arguing for the universality of these values. So when we talk about rights, we know that we are not talking about a modern invasion. Because people who have critiqued human rights have argued that the discussion about rights is a discussion about the West dominating the North dominating the South. But we are having philosophers taking a central role in this discussion before you had that divide. Because if you dig deeper into history, you realize that there were times where, tens of thousands of years ago, when Asia was far ahead of the so-called West today. So even before you talk about the current divide of North-South, there are people who found it necessary to devote considerable time to the discussion of fundamental human rights. Of course, they were outliers in their times. They were outliers because they were talking about things people did not understand at the time. They were talking about things people could not understand at the time. So, philosophy becomes a very important source of human rights. Then religion is also another important source of human rights. Whether you're talking about the African traditional religion, whether you're talking about Hinduism, whether you're talking about Islam, Christianity, all the major religions you can talk about, they have provided a case for human rights. For example, the Christians know that one of the 10 commandments is, thou shalt not kill. And that rule is absolute and inviolable regardless of the benefits to the society. It is inviolable regardless of the benefits to the society. That's why you now hear of a very big movement to end the death penalty. You must have interrogated this in one of your classes. There is no direct correlation. So why should it stay? Why should it stay in the law books? Why should it stay in the law books? But what informs that discussion? It is religion. It is religion. I do not know of any religion that professes to favor murder. I don't know of any religion that professes to favor murder. So religion also becomes a very important source of human rights and the works of great philosophers. You've had historical events over the years that have laid a very firm ground for what we call human rights today. And I'll start with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, passed by France's National Constituent Assembly in 1789. That declaration granted civil rights to commoners, unlike before. Many of you study European history in high school. You're very familiar with this history. But you now had a declaration talking about these things in no uncertain terms. Because you lawyers know that the moment legal documents have ambiguity, it gives legal room to abusers and dictators to violate rights. So it was critical that this declaration addressed these matters in no uncertain terms. Of course, there were a number of other people in the French society that were still not covered under this law. But why we call it a historical progression is that it was still a very huge movement, a step forward in the right direction way back in 1789. That they started on a very good movement. In fact, in France, it created a level of liberalism you cannot find anywhere today. For us in media studies, when we are talking about liberalism in the media industry, it's hard to find a country that is going to compete with France, because in France, because of that background and that history, you're going to have newspapers that have the liberty to critique everybody, including every religion. That's why you even had that the Charlie Hebdo attack in 2015. The things that Charlie Hebdo used to publish were things that would never be published by the Washington Post or New York Times in the US. And when I'm talking about the New York Times, I'm talking about probably the most liberal newspaper in the United States. But these are the things that the New York Times would never dare to publish. I'm not justifying what Charlie Hebdo did, but the point I'm making is the degree of liberalism in France is a class apart, and it is largely informed by these historical developments. Of course, many years later, you had better laws that protected these God-given freedoms. But early in the United States, you also had an important document, the Declaration of Independence on 4th July 1776. Originally, it's 13 states of the US that declared themselves independent. Of course, today we are talking about 50 states and several other territories. But at that time, you had only 13 states that agreed to cut links with the British monarch. But in their Declaration of Independence, they consented that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that every man is born free and equal and is endowed by his Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which is the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. 4th July 1776. So again, in no uncertain terms, the founding fathers of the United States put this in black and white. Of course, the wording of the statements still provided latitude to oppressors to continue oppressing the female folks, the blacks who were still considered slaves, especially in the South of the United States. But the Declaration became a very important document in this historical progression we are talking about. A couple of years later, after the making of the US Constitution, they had their first amendment in 1791. You can imagine that the first amendment to the United States Constitution concentrated on fundamental human rights, not about the longevity of George Washington as the President of the United States, but human rights. That's how important it was. Not about the survival of the politicians. The First Amendment, 1791, it talked about fundamental human rights, including the right to assemble peacefully, the right to belong to a religion, the right to freedom of speech and expression. And it was an entrenched amendment in the Constitution. In that, for you to amend it, you need a referendum in the United States. So Congress can never wake up any one day to think about amending that article of the Constitution. Because you see, if you follow American politics, causing a national referendum on anything might be another cause for an American civil war. You can have plebiscites within states, whether we should use medical marijuana or not, things like that. But a national referendum for all the 50 states of the United States, it's a tough one, my friends. It's a tough one. In fact, if you remember, Barack Obama in his first term, he campaigned, one of his major campaign promises was to bring tighter controls on the gun and its usage. But because the right to bear firearms is a constitutional provision, you've got to walk that route circumspectively. So the 8 years of Obama ended without doing anything substantial in regards to the gun, because it's a constitutionally protected provision, the right to bear firearms. In fact, for them, it has now become their tradition to own a firearm. It's like the way you own a spear or a shield. That's how they take it. So anytime you talk about tighter regulations on the gun, it's an attack on their culture, it's an attack on their independence. Because one of the questions oftentimes asked in the US is, when George Washington was calling us to rebel against the British monarch, did he buy us firearms? So if we didn't have firearms, who would have joined him? Secondly, When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, if we didn't have guns in every homestead, what would have stopped them from reaching the American mainland? But all those arguments are advanced to support a constitutional provision, the right to bear firearms. But the point I was making is that the 1791 amendment, which was the first amendment to the US Constitution, focused on fundamental human rights. Because despite the fact that the declaration in 1776, 4th of July, talked about the right to liberty, life, and the pursuit of happiness, it still provided legal room. Because when you talk about liberty, what do you mean? If you talk about the pursuit to happiness, what do you mean? So politicians can easily argue for their autocratic tendencies. So that's why the first time they sat to amend the constitution, they had to touch on a matter that was key, was fundamental for every American. Again, after the Second World War, history is oftentimes written by the victors. That is how it is. Very unfair, but that's how it is. The victors write history. So the current international system we have that governs us was drafted by the victors. And you can be invited at their pleasure rant and rave. That's why the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, when they were negotiating with Iran, but needed to have Germany, they did not amend the UN treaty to include Germany as a permanent member. They just said we can have a separate arrangement of P5 plus 1. P5 plus 1 versus Iran. So history is written by victors. So, but one of the key observations after the Second World War was the gross violation of human rights. Yet the perpetrators of these crimes, the executors, for many years had hidden under collective responsibility and acting on orders from above. So the experience had to teach the victors on how to prescribe medicine for that recurrent problem. You see, challenges can be good because they teach you. That's why I liked the biographic sketch of this university. It clearly showed that the journey has been long, the climb has been steep, but at the end of the day, you've emerged victorious. You've emerged victorious because every knock teaches you 1 or 2 things, and you come back as a very better person. So the Second World War, with all its disadvantages, it also came with certain advantages, especially in the fight for human rights. So, first of all, you had the torture and the Nuremberg trials.